The sun was setting over Pine Grove High School, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. A young boy, known to his friends as TJ, was walking out of the gym, his basketball shoes squeaking against the polished floor. The familiar smell of wood polish and rubber still lingered in the air as he pushed open the heavy doors, stepping into the cool autumn breeze. TJ wasn't like most other teenagers his age. While many rushed home to play video games or hang out at the mall, he always took the long way home, walking through the older part of town. It was his way of keeping an eye on the neighborhood, especially the elderly folks who'd been there since his grandparents' time. His mom had raced in with a simple but powerful message: a community is only as strong as how we treat our elders. That Thursday evening felt different somehow. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. TJ adjusted his favorite basketball practice shirt, a special one his grandpa had given him before passing away last spring. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple navy blue shirt with their families saying stitched on the back, "Kindness costs nothing, but means everything." As he walked, TJ thought about the game coming up next week. His team had been practicing extra hard, and coach believed they had a real shot at the state championships this year. But basketball wasn't the only thing on his mind. He was also thinking about his science project on community healthcare, inspired by the stories his grandpa used to tell about being one of the first black medical assistants in their town back in the 1960s. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with only the occasional sound of wind chimes and distant dog barks breaking the silence. Old Mrs. Wilson was watering her prized roses as usual, giving TJ her daily wave and smile. Mr. Chen from the corner store was bringing in his display signs, calling out his usual "see you tomorrow, young man." These small interactions were part of what made this route special to TJ. He pulled out his phone to check the time, 5:45 p.m. His mom would be home from her nursing shift soon, and he wanted to help get dinner started. That's another thing about TJ. He'd learned early on that being responsible wasn't just about doing your homework or making your bed. It was about being there for your family and your community. The evening was settling in, streetlights starting to flicker on one by one. TJ could see his breath forming little clouds in the cooling air. He zipped up his light jacket, still warm from practice, and adjusted his backpack. The weight of his textbooks reminded him of the history test tomorrow, but he wasn't too worried. He'd been studying hard, just like his grandpa always encouraged him to do. As he turned the corner onto Cedar Street, TJ noticed how the maple trees were starting to change color. Some leaves had already fallen, creating a colorful carpet on the sidewalks. He made a mental note to ask Mr. Thompson if he needed help raking his yard this weekend. The old man's arthritis had been acting up lately. Little did TJ know that in just a few minutes, his ordinary Thursday evening would turn into something extraordinary. Sometimes the biggest moments in life come when we least expect them, and for TJ, this autumn evening would prove to be one he'd remember forever. The simple decision to take his usual route home would lead to a chain of events that would touch not just one life, but an entire community. He adjusted his shirt one more time, his grandpa's voice echoing in his mind. You never know when you might be somebody's blessing. Those words would take on a whole new meaning in the next few moments, as the sound of someone in distress would soon reach his ears from the direction of Cedar Grove Park. The first thing TJ heard was a soft whimper, almost like a whisper in the wind. He stopped walking, his basketball shoes scraping against the concrete as he turned his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, this time a little clearer, a sound that made his heart skip a beat. "Helped somebody, please help." The voice was shaky and frightened, coming from somewhere near the old oak trees in Cedar Grove Park. TJ didn't hesitate for a second. He dropped his backpack on the nearest bench and jogged toward the sound, his eyes scanning the growing shadows of early evening. That's when he saw her, a small figure on the ground, partially hidden by the fallen leaves. It was Mrs. Rose, the kind lady who always sat on her porch sharing stories about the neighborhood's history with anyone who'd listen. She was the one who'd told TJ all about how the community came together to build the park's playground back in the 1970s. "Mrs. Rose," TJ called out, rushing to her side. She was lying awkwardly on her side, her silver hair dusted with crispy autumn leaves. Her usual neat appearance was disheveled, and her face was etched with pain. What caught TJ's immediate attention was the dark stain spreading on her sleeve, blood seeping through her light blue sweater. "Oh, sweet child," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was feeding the birds, like I do every evening. Those silly leaves, they were so slippery. I should have known better." She tried to smile, but TJ could see she was fighting back tears. TJ quickly assessed the situation, just like his mom had taught him. Working as a nurse, she'd always say, the first step in any emergency is to stay calm and look at what you're dealing with. The cut on Mrs. Rose's arm was deep, not life-threatening, but definitely needed medical attention. She'd also twisted her ankle in the fall, making it impossible for her to get up on her own. The park was quieter than usual at this hour. Most families had headed home for dinner, and the regular evening walkers wouldn't come through for another hour. TJ looked around, no first aid kit in sight, and the nearest store was a good 10 minutes away. Mrs. Rose's breathing was becoming more rapid, and TJ could see she was starting to panic. "My daughter, she'll be worried. I always call her at 6 o'clock every day since her father passed." Her voice trailed off as she winced in pain. The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the trees above them. TJ could feel the temperature dropping, and he noticed Mrs. Rose starting to shiver. He needed to act fast. Looking down at his clothes, his eyes fell on his basketball practice shirt, the one his grandpa had given him. His grandpa's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the easy thing to do. The shirt was more than just fabric. It was one of the last gifts he'd received from his grandpa. But as he looked at Mrs. Rose's trembling form and the blood on her sleeve, he knew what he had to do. Time seemed to slow down as TJ made his decision. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the park. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere nearby, a car door slammed. But in that moment, all TJ could focus on was the elderly woman in front of him who needed help. He gently touched Mrs. Rose's shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me, okay?" His voice was steady and calm, despite the racing of his heart. As he reached for the hem of his cherished shirt, he knew this moment would change not just Mrs. Rose's evening, but something much bigger in their community. The sound of tearing fabric was about to break the evening silence, marking the beginning of a story that would soon touch the hearts of everyone in their small town. But for now, in the growing dusk of Cedar Grove Park, it was just a young boy making a choice that would prove that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the simplest decisions. TJ took a deep breath and looked at his treasured basketball shirt one last time. The fabric was worn soft from countless practices and games, and the stitching of his grandpa's message still stood out clear against the navy blue. "Kindness costs nothing, but means everything." Those words had never felt more real than in this moment. "I'm going to make a bandage," he explained to Mrs. Rose, his voice gentle but confident. "It might not look pretty, but it'll help stop the bleeding until we can get you proper help." She nodded weakly, her eyes widening slightly as she watched him grasp the bottom of his shirt. The sound of tearing fabric seemed impossibly loud in the quiet park. TJ started at the bottom, carefully ripping the shirt into long strips. Each tear felt like a small sacrifice, but somehow it also felt right. His grandpa had always said that things were just things, but helping people, that was what gave life its real meaning. As he worked, TJ remembered all the times he'd watched his mom prepare bandages at home. She'd always say, "Clean, straight, and secure. That's what makes a good bandage." He didn't have the luxury of clean medical supplies, but he could make sure the strips were straight and secure. The autumn wind picked up again, and Mrs. Rose shivered. TJ quickly shrugged off his light jacket and draped it over her shoulders before returning to his task. "My mom's a nurse," he explained as he carefully began wrapping her arm. "She taught me a thing or two about first aid. Let me know if it's too tight, okay?" Mrs. Rose watched his careful movements, her eyes glistening with tears that weren't just from pain. "Your mother must be so proud," she whispered. "And your grandfather." She paused, noticing the way TJ's hands slowed at the mention of his grandpa. "You know," she continued softly, "I remember seeing him around the neighborhood when he'd come to visit you. Always had that kind smile, always stopped to help anyone who needed it." A small smile crossed her face despite her pain. "Looks like that helper's heart of his found its way to you." TJ focused on securing the makeshift bandage, blinking back his own tears. The shirt was now in pieces, transformed from a cherished memento into something even more meaningful. Some strips became the main bandage around Mrs. Rose's wound, while others he used to create a supporting wrap to keep it all in place. "There," he said, checking his work one final time. "That should hold until we can get you to a doctor." He reached for his phone, ready to call for help, but then remembered something important. "It's almost 6 o'clock. Would you like to call your daughter first, so she won't worry?" Mrs. Rose's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Oh, dear child," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How did you know?" "That's exactly what was worrying me most." As TJ helped Mrs. Rose make her daily call to her daughter, he noticed how the evening had grown darker around them. The park's lights were now fully on, creating pools of warm light that pushed back against the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, though whether it was an ambulance or police car, he couldn't tell. The remaining pieces of his grandfather's shirt lay scattered around them like blue petals, a reminder that sometimes the most precious things we own are meant to be given away. His chest was now bare except for his white undershirt, but TJ had never felt warmer. His grandpa would have understood. Maybe he even would have done the same thing. While they waited for help to arrive, TJ kept talking to Mrs. Rose, sharing stories about school and basketball, anything to keep her mind off the pain and cold. He told her about the upcoming game, about his science project, about his dream of becoming a doctor someday. With each word, he could see her relaxing slightly, her breathing becoming more steady. The whole scene was illuminated by the park's lamplights now, casting a gentle glow over them both, a young boy and an elderly woman, strangers just moments ago, now connected by an act of kindness that would soon become the talk of their entire community. But neither of them was thinking about that yet. In that moment, it was just two people, one helping the other, exactly the way TJ's grandpa had always said it should be. The evening air had grown cooler, but TJ barely noticed. He sat cross-legged on the ground next to Mrs. Rose, his phone now in his hand after calling both emergency services and her daughter. His makeshift bandage was holding well, the torn pieces of his grandfather's shirt working better than he'd hoped to stop the bleeding. "You know," Mrs. Rose said softly, her voice steadier now, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years. Seen children grow up, become parents themselves." She paused, adjusting the jacket TJ had draped over her shoulders. "But I don't think I've ever seen a young person show such quick thinking and kindness." TJ felt his cheeks warm at the compliment, but kept his focus on making sure Mrs. Rose stayed comfortable. He'd gathered some fallen leaves to cushion her head and was keeping track of time to report to the paramedics how long she'd been lying there. These were all things he'd learned from watching his mom work, listening to her stories about helping people in emergencies. "I used to work as a teacher," Mrs. Rose continued, her eyes growing distant with memory. "Taught right here at Pine Grove Elementary for 35 years. Your grandfather, he was one of my students, did you know that?" TJ's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? He never told me that." He leaned forward, eager to hear more about this unexpected connection to his grandpa. Mrs. Rose smiled, the pain in her arm momentarily forgotten. "Oh yes, he was in my very first class. Such a bright young boy, always helping others with their math problems. He'd stay after school sometimes, not because he needed help, but because he knew some other students did. That's where he first learned about medicine, you know, from the school nurse he used to help with the younger children's scraped knees." As she spoke, they could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. TJ quickly texted Mrs. Rose's daughter with an update about which hospital they'd likely be heading to. The park's lamplights cast long shadows around them, and somewhere nearby, crickets had started their evening song. "Your grandfather grew up to be such a wonderful man," Mrs. Rose continued. "He'd stop by my house sometimes, years later, checking on me after my husband passed. Always brought me soup when I was sick, his famous chicken noodle recipe." She chuckled softly, then winced as the movement jostled her arm. TJ gently adjusted the makeshift bandage. "Is that why you were crying earlier? When you realized this was his shirt?" Mrs. Rose's eyes filled with tears again, but her smile remained. "Partly yes, but mostly because I see so much of him in you. That same instinct to help, that same gentle spirit. When you turned that precious gift into something to help me, Well, that's exactly what he would have done. The sound of sirens was very close now, and TJ could see flashing lights at the park entrance. He stood up, ready to wave the paramedics over, but Mrs. Rose caught his hand with her good arm. "Wait," she said. "Before they come, I want you to know something. Your grandfather used to say that a true measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they're willing to give up to help others. Today, you proved you're every bit the man he hoped you'd become." The paramedics were making their way across the park now, their uniforms reflecting the red and blue lights from the ambulance. TJ had dealt with his share of tough moments in life, losing his grandpa, facing challenges at school, working hard at basketball. But somehow, this simple praise from Mrs. Rose touched him deeper than any trophy or award ever could. As the medical team approached, TJ stepped back to give them room to work, but stayed close enough that Mrs. Rose could still see him. He watched as they professionally assessed her condition, nodding approvingly at his makeshift bandage. One of them, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, even commented on how well he'd wrapped the wound. "My mom's a nurse," TJ explained again, this time to the paramedics. "She always says knowing how to help others is just as important as knowing when to help them." The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, preparing Mrs. Rose for transport. As they carefully lifted her onto the stretcher, she kept her eyes on TJ, who was gathering his backpack and the remaining scraps of his grandfather's shirt. These pieces, he decided, he would keep, not as a reminder of what he'd lost, but as a symbol of what he'd gained, a deeper understanding of his grandfather's legacy and the true meaning of kindness. The emergency room was busy that evening, filled with the usual hustle of nurses and doctors moving quickly through the halls. TJ sat in the waiting room, his homework spread across his lap, though he hadn't really focused on it. His mom, still in her nursing scrubs from her shift at another hospital, sat beside him, her hand occasionally squeezing his shoulder with pride. When Mrs. Rose's daughter had arrived at the park, she'd insisted they come to the hospital too. "I need to properly thank the young man who helped my mother," she'd said, her eyes full of gratitude. So here they were, waiting for news about Mrs. Rose's condition. The automatic doors swished open, and a tall woman in a doctor's coat walked toward them. "Family of Mrs. Rose," she called out. TJ and his mom stood up alongside Mrs. Rose's daughter. The doctor smiled warmly. "She's doing well." The cut required some stitches, but thanks to the quick first aid she received, there was no serious blood loss. "She's asking to see everyone, especially." She checked her notes. "The young man who gave up his special shirt to help her." As they walked down the corridor, Mrs. Rose's daughter turned to TJ. "Mom told me about that shirt," she said softly. "About how it was from your grandfather." Her voice caught slightly. "You know, your grandfather and my mom go way back. They grew up on the same street." TJ listened intently as she continued. "Mom was one of the first black teachers at Pine Grove Elementary, back when things weren't easy for people of color in education. Your grandfather was in her very first class. They supported each other through some tough times." They reached Mrs. Rose's room, where she was sitting up in bed, her arm properly bandaged now. Her face lit up when she saw TJ. "There's my guardian angel," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in the park. "Come here, dear. There's something I want to show you." Mrs. Rose's daughter reached into her mother's purse and pulled out an old photograph, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. "I brought this as soon as Mom called me," she explained, handing it to TJ. The photograph was slightly faded but still clear. A black and white image of a classroom from decades ago. In the front row stood a young boy with a familiar smile, and behind him, a much younger Mrs. Rose, her hand resting proudly on his shoulder. "Class of 1962, Mrs. Rose said softly. "Your grandfather wrote his essay that year about wanting to work in medicine. I still remember how his eyes lit up when he talked about helping people." TJ stared at the photograph, his vision blurring with tears. His mom wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "Your grandpa would be so proud," she whispered. Mrs. Rose continued, her own eyes glistening. "We all face moments in life where we have to make quick decisions. Sometimes those decisions mean giving up something precious to help someone else. Your grandfather did that for me once too." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "It was during a terrible storm in '65. My car had broken down, and I was worried about missing an important teaching evaluation. Your grandfather gave up his chance to take an important exam that day to help me get to school. He had to take the exam later, but he said something I never forgot: some things can wait, but helping people can't. The room fell quiet except for the soft beeping of hospital machines. TJ looked down at his plain white undershirt, thinking about the pieces of his grandfather's shirt now safely tucked away in his backpack. Somehow, knowing this history, the sacrifice felt even more meaningful. "I have something else to show you," Mrs. Rose said, nodding to her daughter. From another bag came a familiar-looking piece of fabric, navy blue with neat stitching. "Your grandfather wore this shirt at his high school graduation. I kept it all these years because he gave it to me as a thank you for believing in him." "The message on your shirt? That was something I used to say in class every morning." TJ's mom gasped softly. "That's where that saying came from. All these years, I thought." Mrs. Rose smiled. "Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it? Your father took those words to heart, lived by them, passed them on to you, and now," she gestured to her bandaged arm, "now you're living them too." The hospital room didn't feel like a hospital room anymore. It felt like a sacred space where past and present were meeting, where a simple act of kindness had unveiled a deeper connection that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Outside, the evening had turned to night, but inside this room, hearts were growing lighter with each revealed memory, each shared story. News travels fast in small towns, but kindness travels even faster. By the time the weekend rolled around, the story of what happened in Cedar Grove Park had touched nearly every corner of the community. It wasn't just about a boy helping an elderly woman anymore. It had become something bigger, something that made people stop and think about their own connections to each other. It started at church that Sunday morning. The pastor, his voice warm with emotion, shared the story during his sermon. He didn't mention TJ by name. The boy had asked to stay anonymous, but he spoke about how a young man's sacrifice had reminded him of the true meaning of community. "Sometimes," he said, "the smallest acts of kindness reveal the biggest truths about who we are." After the service, people gathered in small groups, sharing their own stories about Mrs. Rose and her decades of teaching. Old photographs were pulled from wallets and purses, showing classes from years gone by. One elderly man, his hands shaking slightly as he held up a yellowed class picture, pointed out TJ's grandfather standing next to a young Mrs. Rose. "That man," he said, his voice thick with memory, "he helped me learn English when I first came to this country. Never made me feel different or out of place." At the local diner, where families gathered for their after-church meals, the owner had put up a small sign near the register. "Kindness costs nothing, but means everything." When customers asked about it, she'd tell them about the boy who tore up his grandfather's gift to help someone in need. She'd then point to a faded photograph on the wall, one showing TJ's grandfather helping to rebuild the diner after a storm in the 1970s. The story reached the high school too. In Monday morning's assembly, the principal spoke about community service, using the park incident as an example without naming names. But TJ could feel the gentle pats on his back from teammates who knew, could see the proud smiles from teachers who'd heard the full story through the neighborhood grapevine. What touched people most wasn't just the act itself, but the connections it revealed. Everyone, it seemed, had a story about either Mrs. Rose or TJ's grandfather. The local grocery store owner remembered how Mrs. Rose would buy extra supplies for students who couldn't afford them. The elderly barber recalled how TJ's grandfather would give free medical advice to people who couldn't afford a doctor's visit. At the senior center, where Mrs. Rose usually played cards on Tuesday afternoons, her regular group decided to start a new tradition. They began collecting stories about acts of kindness in the community, writing them down in a leather-bound book. For the next generation, they said, so they'll know where they come from. The middle school art teacher, inspired by the story, asked her students to create paintings about kindness in their community. The results were surprising and touching. Children drew pictures of neighbors helping neighbors, of small everyday moments that made life better for everyone. One student painted a simple scene of torn blue fabric being transformed into bandages, though she couldn't have known the real story. Local businesses started putting up signs offering free services to elderly residents, everything from lawn care to grocery delivery. The high school basketball team, led by their coach, organized a new program where players would volunteer to help senior citizens with household tasks. They called it the Grandfather's Legacy Program, though only a few knew the full meaning behind the name. Even the town council took notice. At their monthly meeting, they discussed installing better lighting in Cedar Grove Park and setting up emergency call boxes. "We need to take care of each other," one council member said, just like that young man took care of Mrs. Rose. But perhaps the most meaningful impact wasn't in these visible changes. It was in the way people started looking at each other differently. Neighbors who had barely spoken before found themselves stopping to chat. Young people began offering their seats to elderly passengers on the bus without being asked. Small acts of kindness that had always been there suddenly became more noticeable, more appreciated. At the local coffee shop, where high school students often gathered after classes, conversations started changing. Instead of just talking about games and grades, they shared stories about their grandparents, about family history, about the connections that tied their community together. One boy brought in his grandfather's old leather jacket, sharing how it had been given to him just before his grandfather passed away. "I get it now," he said quietly, looking at TJ across the table. "Sometimes the most valuable things we own are meant to be shared." The story had touched something deep in the community's heart, reminding everyone that they were all connected in ways they hadn't realized. It wasn't just about a torn shirt or a bandaged arm anymore. It was about the invisible threads that tied generations together, about how one person's kindness could echo through the years and inspire others to be better, to do better, to care more. A month had passed since that evening in Cedar Grove Park. The autumn leaves had mostly fallen now, creating a colorful carpet across the town. On this particular Saturday morning, TJ stood in front of his mirror, getting ready for what felt like an important day. He smoothed down his new shirt, a gift he'd received just yesterday, one that made his heart swell every time he looked at it. The shirt was navy blue, just like his grandfather's had been. But this one was special in a different way. It had been made by the local sewing circle, a group of elderly ladies who met at the community center every Wednesday. They'd taken their time with it, stitching not just his grandfather's saying on the back, "Kindness costs nothing, but means everything," but adding something new underneath. A legacy continued. What made the shirt even more meaningful was that Mrs. Rose had helped design it. She'd recovered well from her fall, and though she still used a cane, she'd insisted on being part of the project. "Every stitch," she told him, "is filled with gratitude not just from me, but from our whole community." Today was the first meeting of what the town had started calling the Bridge Builders Program. It had grown from that simple act in the park into something nobody had expected. The high school gym was filled with people of all ages, students, parents, grandparents, teachers, and community members. They'd come together to launch a new mentorship program, pairing young people with elderly residents to share skills, stories, and support. As TJ walked into the gym with his mom, he could hardly believe what he saw. The walls were covered with photographs spanning decades of community history. Someone had created a timeline showing how one generation had helped another over and over again. His grandfather's photo was there, alongside Mrs. Rose's class picture. But there were hundreds of others too, each telling its own story of kindness and connection. The local newspaper editor, an elderly man who'd been covering town news for over 40 years, had helped organize the event. He stood at the podium, his voice strong despite his age. "We often think history is about big events," he said, "but sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes." A month ago, a young man tore up a precious gift to help someone in need. That simple act reminded us of something we'd started to forget, that we're all connected, all responsible for each other. Mrs. Rose sat in the front row, beaming proudly. Beside her was her daughter, holding that old photograph from 1962. They'd framed it now, adding it to a new collection they called Threads of Kindness, a display showing how small acts of generosity had woven through their town's history. The school principal stepped up next, announcing a new scholarship in TJ's grandfather's name. "This scholarship," she explained, "isn't just about grades. It's about character, about seeing a need and meeting it, about understanding that true leadership means being willing to give up something precious to help others." But the biggest surprise came when the town's elderly residents presented their gift to the younger generation. They'd spent weeks collecting their stories, hundreds of them, about times when someone had shown them unexpected kindness. These stories had been bound into books, one for each classroom in the school district. So our children will know, Mrs. Rose explained, that they come from a long line of people who knew how to care for each other. TJ sat with his basketball team, all of them wearing navy blue shirts similar to his. The team had decided to make it their unofficial uniform for community service days. Their coach had added a new tradition. Before every game, they shared a story about kindness they'd witnessed or performed that week. As the meeting continued, people began sharing their own stories. A grocery store owner told about how TJ's grandfather had helped his family when they first arrived in town. A retired firefighter remembered how Mrs. Rose had stayed late after school to help him learn to read. Each story connected to another, creating a web of kindness that stretched across generations. Near the end of the gathering, Mrs. Rose's daughter stood up to make an announcement. She held up a familiar-looking piece of fabric, one of the remaining strips from TJ's grandfather's shirt. "This," she said, "will be framed in our community center. Not because it's just a piece of cloth, but because it represents something bigger, the moment when a young man showed us that the best gifts are the ones we give away." As people began to mingle and share refreshments, TJ felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mrs. Rose, her eyes twinkling. "You know," she said softly, "your grandfather once told me that he hoped his grandchildren would understand what really matters in life. I think he'd be amazed to see how one simple choice you made has brought our whole community closer together." TJ looked around the gym, at the faces both young and old, at the photos on the walls, at the books of stories waiting to be shared. He thought about his grandfather's shirt, not the torn one, but the message it had carried. In the end, it hadn't been just about helping one person. It had been about reminding an entire community that they were all connected, all responsible for each other, all part of a story that was still being written. And as he stood there, wearing his new shirt with pride, TJ realized that sometimes the greatest gifts we receive come from what we're willing to give away. His grandfather had known that. Mrs. Rose had taught that. And now, a whole new generation was learning it too, one act of kindness at a time.